Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Corombos of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Hey, really glad you're with us for the Tuesday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. We do have good, bad, and crazy martinis for you today, as usual. And Jim, we've looked at this a couple times already, and we'll certainly be looking at it more as we get closer to Election Day, which is now just 6 weeks away. Early voting already underway in some states, and will begin in more and more states as we go along here. But the Senate race right now, 51-49 Democrats. Looks like West Virginia, barring something really weird happening, will be a Republican pickup, which brings it to 50-50, which would leave the majority in the Senate at the hands of whichever party wins the presidency, because the vice president would break ties, just like it happened in the first 2 years of the Biden administration. But Republicans are looking better and better in one particular race, and they're so close in so many others where the Democratic incumbents and Democratic favorites are still significantly under 50%, which has to make Republicans happy. So if you look at the new poll from Scott Rasmussen, not Rasmussen Reports, but Scott Rasmussen, who founded that organization, then sold it. And I think his numbers are usually a little more reliable than the current Rasmussen Reports. But according to his numbers in Montana, the former retired Navy SEAL Tim Sheehy at 50%, which is a significant number. Jon Tester, the three-term incumbent, at 43%. And he's going to have polls coming out tomorrow, I think, on Ohio, and then later in the week on Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, all three of which are much, much tighter than the Democratic incumbents in those states would prefer. So when you look at a 7-point margin for a challenger in a state where Tester's got to have basically universal name recognition, Jim, I think his luck is about to run out unless something major happens here in the next few weeks.
Yeah, Scott Rasmussen is a guy I've spoken to a bunch of times. I think his personal beliefs are right of center, but I think he puts great pride in trying to do the best poll he can and get the results as close to what reality is as he possibly can. And I just think really highly of him. Also, there's another institution called Rasmussen Reports. And I'll just leave it at that to give you a sense of how I feel about the two of those. When Scott Rasmussen says the Republican challenger is ahead, I don't know if I want to say take it to the bank and bet your mortgage on it. You really shouldn't be betting your mortgage on anything, come to think of it. Not even against the Jets or the Bears. But that's a strong indicator. That is a sign. And this lines up with other polling and just the general vibes you're seeing from it. Our Jack Butler spent some time out in the state and has a piece in the print copy of National Review. I talked a bit about that in today's Morning Jolt, and I also looked at a bunch of these other Senate races. The math you went through makes absolute sense. Republicans are really looking at a floor of 50. I don't buy into any of this hype that Republicans are in danger of losing Texas, Ted Cruz against Colin Allred. I don't believe that the Florida Democratic Party, having gotten crushed 2 years ago, is suddenly going to make some sort of amazing comeback against Rick Scott. I don't believe that Deb Fischer is in. I need something beyond internal polls or outsider, political action committee polls to indicate that Deb Fischer really is in trouble. So they're starting at 50. Sheehy would be number 51. So boom, you got a Republican Senate. Now, ideally, you would want more. And in the latter half of today's Jolt, I'd be very curious to see what Rasmussen's numbers are, particularly for Ohio and Pennsylvania. Sherrod Brown was one of those guys people thought, in a state that Trump's probably going to win by 9 or 10 points, this guy should be in trouble. And now it looks like he is in trouble to Moreno. At least one poll had him down by 1 point. Pennsylvania, McCormick is just your all-star candidate going up against Bob Casey. I looked it up, Greg. Bob Casey has been in public office since 1996, or he was elected to public office first in 1996. You and I were in college then, right?
Yes.
The Macarena was a big deal. No one had heard of the name Monica Lewinsky, right? That the perspective, he's been in public office for a long, long time. And I also looked it up. He votes with the Biden administration 98.5% of the time. As we all know, Pennsylvania is a fairly purple state. Trump won it in 2016. Pat Toomey won a bunch of Senate races there. If you're a purplish state and your senator is voting with the president, Joe Biden, in a margin that is roughly equivalent to human body temperature, it's time for a change. And it was 98.5. So maybe Bob Casey's a little chilly. But beyond that, that's a good perspective on that. So, look, Republicans, looking at 50, excellent shot at 51. And then maybe seats 52, 53, 54 might be lining up. We'll see how things shake out. But I think, look, for in a year where it feels like almost everything's gone wrong for Republicans or things are really frustrated, North Carolina, it just is one of those good examples of finally some things are breaking the way the Republicans wanted in these closing weeks here.
Yeah, it's always frustrating when you get closer and closer to Election Day, especially with Senate candidates, because there's 6 years in between. And so these Democrats can just roll right along with the Washington Democrats for 5 years or more, and then they rediscover their blue jeans and their flannel, and I'm one of you. I drive a truck.
Time to go hunting. Time to,
Exactly.
I believe the Second Amendment protects your right to hunt, even though it's not in the wording of the Second Amendment.
Right, exactly. So Tester's trying to run that old playbook. You've explained in the past how every previous election cycle he was up was favorable to Democrats, and less so, at least compared to those other 3 cycles this time around. And, Democrats just do this a lot. Tim Kaine is up again this year. He's running against Hung Kao. He's probably going to win. He's up by probably 5-6 points at least at this point. He always runs out this same, moderate sounding language. Back when he was running for governor years ago, he's like, I'm personally against abortion, but who am I to say this? And so then this idea that they're really not of the establishment of their own party. And then you look at numbers like that, because Bob Casey pulls that same stuff in Pennsylvania, tries to make himself seem moderate, but the numbers don't lie. And whether it's Tim Kaine, whether it's Bob Casey, whether it's a lot of these other people, Sherrod Brown, proudly to the left, he'll own it.
Yeah.
These other people pretending that there's something that they're not every 6 years, just agonizing, and hopefully it won't pay off for Tester this time.
Yeah, I try not to poke other people who do my job in the eye too often, but for an astonishing number of Washington correspondents who don't spend a lot of time looking at these folks, moderate for a Democrat means demeanor.
Yes.
It means that they speak in an even tone. It means that they don't pound the table. They're not verbal bomb through. It has nothing to do with their voting record. And to me, if you're a moderate, you should vote against the party orthodoxy. You should vote against the president of your party. I don't know, 20% of the time. Is that asking too much? A third? And these guys can accumulate voting with the president high 90-some% and still get a reputation as a moderate, which is completely unearned. But that's one of my pet peeves. And Greg, and sometimes I just want to Christy Noem it.
All right, Jim. Tim Kaine, former vice presidential candidate. Tim Walz is the Democratic vice presidential nominee this time. I think they somewhat regret that choice already, but all depends if they win, I guess. One of the things that you and I have talked about at times, of course, is his dismal record as governor of Minnesota, which should be getting a lot of coverage, and of course isn't, because, like you said yesterday, he's getting the America's Dad treatment from the mainstream media. Not the guy who waited to call out the National Guard. Not the guy who created Minnesota as a safe haven for teens who wanted to transition and their parents didn't support that, and radical abortion laws and all this other stuff. But he's also a major villain on the COVID nursing home death front. Andrew Cuomo and Gretchen Whitmer and Tom Wolf and Phil Murphy, Gavin Newsom, obviously, are some of the worst names associated with that. But actually, one of the worst percentages, maybe the worst of all, Minnesota. And for the same reason, because nursing homes were required to take recovering COVID patients who hadn't actually recovered and gotten immune from COVID yet. Over 80% of COVID deaths in Minnesota occurred in nursing homes, despite there being incredibly locked down. And this was noted as early as May of 2020, according to Hot Air. David Strom with the story. And so he says, among nursing facility residents, we estimated a prevalence of 143 cases per 1,000 residents and 28 deaths per 1,000 residents. Residents in long-term care settings accounted for only 21% of Minnesota's total COVID-19 cases, yet they experienced 81% of total COVID-19 deaths. So you put the most vulnerable population in with people who have the disease that can kill them. It's not hard to figure out how we get to this point. So once again, Tim Walz's record is one of failure, but the media doesn't care.
No, and look, if you were a governor over the last 5 years or so, probably the two biggest and most consequential challenges you had to face were COVID and the George Floyd riots. And Tim Walz is 0 for 2. Now, one of the consequences of Tim Walz being covered as, America's corny dad, look at him fixing that carburetor, all that kind of coverage, is that I feel like the public has heard next to nothing about what he actually did as governor. Very early on, I was pointing out the sheer number of waste, fraud, and abuse scandals in Minnesota state government since Tim Walz became governor. Maybe I'm looking in the wrong places, but I don't feel like I've seen any coverage of any of that. Greg, I feel like I've heard a lot of coverage of him being defensive coordinator back on that high school football team. And we heard a lot of talk about that. And look, technically, that if you say, Tim Walz, do you have any familiarity with defense issues? I guess that counts. Yes, we can check that box. It's really more, prevent defense than national defense. But fine, I'll give him credit for that. But like we don't talk about how he's done as governor is really front and center to how's he going to do the job as vice president, and if God forbid anything ever happens to Kamala Harris, how would he handle the duties of the presidency? And there's just a total lack of interest in that. A colleague of mine mentioned something else, which I again, when somebody says, "Oh, nobody's written about this," there's always a chance somebody did, and it just didn't blow up or go viral or come across my social media feed or any of that stuff. But again, I read on any given day Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times, obviously NR. And then I'm scanning everything else, and I'm clicking through, and I read a bunch of stuff in Politico, and I read a bunch of stuff, bloggers at Red State, Washington Examiner. I feel like I'm reading a lot. And if there was the topic this person said is, have you heard anything about, in Harris's ads right now, she begins, which is about the border. She says, I'm the only one in this race who has prosecuted transnational criminal organizations that smuggled people, guns, and drugs. It's a very good line. Greg, have you run into any article discussing who she prosecuted and how and what happened?
No.
I mean, she talked a little bit about one case early in her term and her and you think about it, I look it up. She's there for 20 years. How is it this woman is depending on which poll you believe, on the verge of becoming the next president of the United States? Obviously, it's a while ago, but it's what put her on the path she's on, and she's talking about it in her ads. Could we mention, is there some big gang leader she took down? Is there some cartel she tried to, I can't believe we've heard next to nothing about this. Again, if you've run across this article and I missed it, send it to me. But that's another case. And my sneaking suspicion is we have a national media that believes Trump must be stopped at all costs. Ergo, we cannot spend any time writing about Tim Walz and waiting 24 hours to send out the National Guard during the rioting of George Floyd. We can't spend any time talking about COVID and him having the worst, a record so bad, Andrew Cuomo is looking at him and saying, wow, that guy's got problems, right? All the, or any of this other stuff. And it's kind of this thing look, we'll tell you about Harris and Walz once they're safely in office. Then it's okay for you to know who you've just elected and what their records actually are. And that's not the way the system is supposed to work, and it's frustrating. And I know lots of conservative media has tried looking into this. The lack of curiosity in the part of the mainstream media is really appalling and kind of represents a breakdown of how the entire system is supposed to work.
No, it's just 3.5 months of cheerleading from this whole switch. They were so excited that they finally kicked Biden to the curb because they thought he was going to lose, and now they have all this pent-up momentum behind Kamala Harris. I'd be curious, Jim, if she actually focused on her prosecution of transnational criminal organizations when she ran for Senate, or maybe she ran on other stuff. I don't know. Be interesting to go back and look at those ads and see what she actually stressed compared to what she's stressing now and acting like.
She's probably not making it up, but how effective was it? Were they big fish? Were they little fish? Is she exaggerating the effectiveness of what she did? These are all real legit questions that apparently a whole bunch in the press have no interest in asking. Not that they could ask her because she doesn't do any interviews or press conferences.
Right, or how many they prosecuted. I do know she prosecuted people who exposed Planned Parenthood for harvesting and selling fetal body parts. Much we do know. All right, Jim, on to our crazy martini now, and this sounds like a broken record, largely because it is. We are about to hit the new fiscal year. October 1st starts the new fiscal year, and looks like Congress is going to kick the can down the road. The House tried to pass a continuing resolution that included the SAVE Act, which puts stronger safeguards in place to prevent non-citizens from voting. When you've had an influx of possibly as many as 10 million people into the country, you definitely want to make sure that the safeguards are in place. And we've seen the states that found non-citizens on their rolls, and in the hundreds in some cases. But then there's the issue of just spending in general. Seems like we always get this kick the can down the road, giant omnibus bill, on to the next omnibus bill, shut down theater, stress that it might happen. Sometimes it does happen for a little while. Well, first of all, the House of Representatives couldn't muster the votes to pass the continuing resolution with the SAVE Act, so that's certainly frustrating. But as Mike Johnson prepares to do what he doesn't want to do here and pass a short continuing resolution, he also makes the important point about which chamber actually did its job on appropriations this year and which one is the obstructionist, which makes it even more frustrating that the obstructionists are the ones who are largely going to win this temporary battle here. So here's what Speaker Johnson said this morning.
This is Chuck Schumer's fault. It is not the House Republicans that we're in the position where we have to have a resolution to continue funding the government at the end of the fiscal year. We did our work. We passed 12 appropriations bills through the committee process in record time. We put them on the floor. Almost 73% of federal funding has been passed through the House. We sent it all over to the Senate, and they've done nothing. They did not one bill, and they would not negotiate with us on the top line. So here we are. We loathe CRs as much as anyone, but this is the situation that the Senate Democrat leadership put us in.
So, Jim, it's frustrating that, the House does the work and the leverage is still with the Democrats and the White House. It seems like no matter what the breakdown is, they always have the leverage, which is infuriating. But I mean, the job of the legislative branch, if you look at Article 1 of the Constitution, is to deal with the appropriations and the funding. Everything else is secondary to that responsibility. The Senate has done literally nothing.
Yeah, inexcusable. Probably not any worse than we come to expect from Chuck Schumer, but again, a representation of what he believes the Senate is there for. The House Republicans, there was nothing good for Republicans in having a government shut down like a month before Election Day.
Sure.
Members got to get back to their districts and campaign. Whenever there's a government shutdown, neither party really benefits, but Republicans usually get blamed more. There are two general reactions. There are Democrats blame Republicans. Republicans are upset because they tend to perceive their side as losing, and a whole bunch of people in the middle are very pox on both your houses. So it really very rarely, there's no easy way for Republicans to win that. Sounds like Trump actually may have been supportive in the past and has been, talked out of it by Speaker Johnson. By the way, you listen to that soundbite there. Speaker Johnson, his schedule probably wouldn't allow him to be on every Sunday show every weekend, but he just is such a clear. Remember we talked about just a moment ago about how Virginia, Democrats get accused of being moderates because of their tone.
Yes.
Mike Johnson isn't frothing at the mouth. He just sounds very reasonable, very matter of fact, very, Joe Friday-ish. And, I think that's very effective communicating. And so I just like, Speaker Johnson, keep it up and keep it up out there. But also, this is a point that, really should be front and center. We sent all these appropriation bills and the Senate did nothing. Who is at fault for the fact that we don't have a budget passed by the beginning of the fiscal year? Seems very straightforward. And also, you're not going to, I would blame the president, Greg, but no one's seen him. So, no, he's speaking at the UN General Assembly. And he did, so he talked a lot about climate change. Great. But then the other thing was that he talked about how he made some points where I unsurprisingly agree with on autocrats and dictators. And he said, it's not supposed to be about that. It's supposed to be about serving your people. And the most amazing thing, Greg, was that in the audience, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Bashir Assad, and Kim Jong-un all said, "Oh my God, you're right, Mr. President." And they all resigned right there. And they just said that they're going to become democracies and they support human rights. Just one lecture from Joe Biden was all it took to get them to completely change that. Obviously, I'm thinking, Biden did say that. The foreign dictators were not in the audience. The representatives of their governments were. And I agree with it, but I think we need more than a tisk-tisk. I think we need to do more than wag our finger at them. At minimum, we should be like, boom, here's my big stick, militarily, and just kind of lay that out there and just kind of let them know that if you keep making trouble, there are going to be consequences.
Yeah, nobody's paying attention to Joe Biden anymore.
Including this podcast, a lot of days.
Yes, including this podcast, including lawmakers. They know that he's not anywhere close to where he was or even probably paying attention to the process at this point. They'll shove the CR in front of him and he'll sign it and he'll go back to watching Matlock. So anyway, Jim, on that note, we'll call time for today. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us today. Do subscribe to the podcast if you don't already. Tell your friends about us as well. Thanks also for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. They really do help us out a lot. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a terrific Tuesday and join us again on Wednesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.